And now, this.
Okay, let's go. Harry Tracy.
Harry Tracy. Trigger warning. The following contains the authentic accounts of factual historical figures and events. If historical information may upset you, then please withdraw now. Retreat.
Well, I guess you know who I am.
Harry Tracy is a true story. This telling is authored from sources spanning over 120 years. All characterized quotations are verbatim from interviews, newspaper articles, and testimonials taken at the time. Scott Martinez. Part 1. Introduction. In all the criminal lore of the country, there is no record equal to that of Harry Tracy for cold-blooded nerve, desperation, and thirst of crime. Jesse James, compared with Tracy, is a Sunday school teacher. Seattle Daily Times, July 3rd, 1902.
Extra, extra, read all about it. Dateline 1902. Ragtime and science fiction. Skyscrapers and invention. A new century.
But way out west.
Tracy again escapes. Revolt at the penitentiary. 2 desperate convicts kill 3 guards and escape.
Well, I am Tracy.
Sensational outbreak at the state prison. Harry Tracy and David Merrill. 3 guards killed by 2 desperate convicts. Desperate and dangerous. Convicts escaped. A daring effort to secure their liberty.
Harry Tracy etched his name into infamy when he and accomplice David Merrill shot their way out of the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, killing 3 guards and wounding 1 prisoner on June 9th, 1902.
Harry Tracy and David Merrill escape the Oregon State Penitentiary.
Joseph D. Lee, superintendent of the Oregon State Penitentiary, in his biennial report, 1902.
Guard Frank S. Merrill and wall guards S.R.T. Jones and B.T. Tiffany were fatally shot. Convict Frank S. Ingram received a bullet in his left leg, which necessitated its amputation. The escapees scaled the wall by means of a ladder. Several shots were fired at them, but the range was long and they were unhurt. The guns were placed in the molding room. They did not go there of their own accord.
Joseph Kelly, 13 years in the Oregon Penitentiary.
Guard Farrell was standing near the door rolling a cigarette when Tracy and Merrill picked up the guns and walked up to Farrell. He turned and saw them coming and threw up his hands.
You had your day, and now it is mine.
Shot the officer without another remark.
Harry Tracy and David Merrill were long gone. However, while on the run, Tracy would reportedly kill Merrill himself,
Tracy killed Dave Merrill,
cheating his accomplice in a 10-pace duel, Harry turning at 8, shooting Merrill in the back, and then the head.
Body identified to be Merrill. The face is unrecognizable.
David Merrill, you mean? Oh, he ain't around anymore. I killed that son of a bitch several days ago.
The first thing we found was a black hat.
A foul odor led the boy to the man's body.
Dead body of Outlaw Merrill is found. Warden James will not swear that it is convict.
The prison doctor declared the corpse delivered to the Oregon State Penitentiary to be David Merrill.
Body identified to be Merrill.
However, Joseph Bunko Kelly, in 13 years in the Oregon State Penitentiary, declared that he and other inmates did not believe that it was David Merrill. I do not believe it was Merrill's body that was brought back to the penitentiary.
Oregon boot is regarded as one of the best and most effective shackles known.
David Merrill was said to have gained a limp from his time in the Oregon boot.
No one has ever escaped from an Oregon boot.
Tracy was no stranger to the Oregon boot, having been manacled before in Utah and Colorado. A thick, heavy metal weight that locks around the top of one's ankle.
The only way to get an Oregon boot off is with a key. Tracy murders attributed to revenge for being forced to don heavy boot.
Some inmates would later claim David Merrill's permanent and pronounced injury was not apparent on the faceless corpse determined to be David Merrill when the body was returned to prison.
A big scar on his ankle from the burn, and the band of the boot wore a dent into the skin. There was a hole in the ankle half an inch deep. The body they brought back had gray hair, and Merrill had none. Merrill is alive today. Merrill is dead.
He was no good, like I said.
Did Tracy kill Merrill?
Harry Tracy's accounts of the duel.
I miss him like hell, though.
His line of reasoning to kill and personal opinion of David Merrill varied and conflicted. 5 a.m., July 1st, 1902.
Tracy on the water.
Tracy appeared on South Bay, Puget Sound, near Capital City Oyster Company, alone.
Steals a launch and sails away. Makes his way to Seattle.
The N&S, a large gasoline launch, was tied just outside. Tracy spotted Captain A.J. Clark.
When I entered the house at the oyster plant, I noticed a man with a gun immediately. I thought it was a joke that had gone too far. Who are you? I demanded. I am Tracy.
He turned pirate to reach Seattle. Tracy sailed the bounding main.
Can a man cruise around the Puget Sound in that boat?
Sure, it's a great boat.
Would it take a fellow to Seattle?
Easy as pie.
How long a trip would it be?
It's a 6 to 8 hour cruise.
Then that's where we're going, as soon as I've had breakfast. You got any objection to that?
Convict Harry Tracy lands near Seattle, appropriates a gasoline launch at South Bay near Olympia, forces 4 men into service, and effects a landing at Meadow Point.
While I was mortally afraid of the man, still he made a fella feel at home. Harry Tracy was now a lone fugitive, leading a 2-state chase, taking over private homes and boats. He was pursued by the Army and the Navy, hundreds of sheriffs, deputized militia, countless armed and enthusiastic volunteers, and packs of newspapermen.
Another bold holdup by convict Tracy.
He walked into Seattle with his rifle in one hand and his pack over his shoulder. Seattle, July 3rd, 1902.
Tracy's trail of blood. Oregon convict kills 2 officers near Seattle.
The 1902 4th of July weekend was planned to be noted for the ceremonial events around the battleship Nebraska keel-laying ceremony, but there was only one dominating topic of discussion: Harry Tracy. Escaped convict Harry Tracy killed Neil Raleigh, Policeman E.E. Breeze, Deputy Sheriff Charles Raymond, and Sheriff John Williams in 2 separate gun battles.
Desperado engages in 2 hot battles and continues his wild flight.
The fight occurred at 3:15 in the afternoon and was over in an incredibly short time. Harry Tracy instantly disappeared.
As Williams collapsed, Tracy disappeared. No sign of Tracy.
The whole adventure had hardly taken more than 2 or 3 minutes.
Drives away with stolen horse and buggy.
I'm a deputy sheriff and one of the men on Tracy's tail.
Tracy stepped into the middle of the road.
I must get to Seattle at once and I need your wagon. There is no time for delay.
When holding a home hostage, something Harry did frequently, the latest newspapers were the first thing Tracy wanted.
Rewards add up to over $5,600 for capture of Harry Tracy.
As ruthless and as violent as Tracy would prove to be, some of the people whose homes he entered reported Harry ultimately to be mannerly, courteous, and charismatic.
Well, he made himself useful around the place. We were putting up a barn, and Tracy spent much of his time carrying boards and nailing on the roof. He was a first-class worker.
A gallant, tender-hearted man with a prodigious love for little children.
Very polite. Offered to pay any price I wanted for some food.
To his pursuers, Harry would leave behind notes, messages.
To whom it may concern, tell Cudahy to take a tumble and let me alone, or I will fix him plenty. I'll be on my way to Wyoming. If your horses was any good, I would swap with you. Thanks for the cool drink, Harry Tracy.
Tracy wrote poetry.
Echoing the outlaw poet Black Bart, Harry left behind Doggerel.
Doggerel, coarsely written boastful rhyme left behind to taunt the law.
He is out for notoriety, and not at all for gain. He may arrest a schoolboy, or pull a hobo from a train. We left the Salt Lake Pen as the sun was setting low, and we walked along the railroad tracks until our legs refused to go. But we struck Park City early when the morning sunbeams lit on our striped pantaloons where the happy parties sit. When we started on our journey for our home they call the Wall, where very few detectives ever dare to call. Yours with kind love and best wishes, Harry Tracy.
Newspaper stories about Tracy, the daring desperado, garnered the adulation, even sympathies of some of the citizens, and Harry became their hero.
He's a brick, a jewel, a persecuted man.
Harry appeared to be everywhere, certainly in the press, and abundant anecdotal stories.
Knew Tracy well, worked with him on the railroads in the Northwest, lines out of Seattle, Spokane, and Helena.
I would have poisoned Tracy, but he watched me too closely.
Not since the gold rush had the Northwest gripped the public imagination or garnered this much attention. Many came to view Harry Tracy as a victim of the system, a downtrodden working-class Robin Hood. To other people, Harry Tracy was just plain terrifying.
Wake of death. Convicts slay guards and escape. Victims number 3.
Hate him, fear him, or cheer him on, Harry had instant market appeal and made perfect fodder for the headlines.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
And the newspapers covered him extensively.
Tracy likes the lake.
Harry Tracy was used to sell lakefront real estate.
Look out, Tracy and Merrill.
Appeared in an ad for Herman Wise, a clothing store and hatter in Astoria.
Look out that you are not held up and made to pay more than your neighbor.
There was a Tracy cocktail at the bar and a 5-cent cigar named in his honor. Several theater companies produced plays about the outlaw, with people who had actually been his captives reenacting their exploits.
At the Bon Marché, children should come with their parents as the crowds will be dense. At the 3rd Avenue Theater, Tracy is more of a hero on stage.
That the average Seattle small boy witnessed the play and he will exchange his birthright for 30-30, kill his father and mother to effect his escape. Packed houses, who'd been told Harry Tracy was a hole-in-the-wall gang member, rode the outlaw trail with Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch. That bad man Tracy was evil. Evil as a man could be.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the posse in the cast is behind in its lines, there will be a short intermission.
So when Harry Tracy brazenly entered the city of Seattle, the summer of 1902, the entire Puget Sound was actively exercising the most exhaustive search in the region's history, looking for him.
Bandit Tracy heading north. Boat found in which he escaped.
When cornered, Harry would shoot and kill without hesitation.
Throw up your hands, you son of a bitch.
Tracy's trail of blood. Oregon convict kills 2 officers near Seattle.
Then Tracy would disappear completely from the city into the dense northwest forest still surrounding Seattle, and finally over the Cascade Mountains to eastern Washington.
Posse hot after Tracy. He is endeavoring to get to Idaho, but his chances of escape look slim.
Popular dime novels, then silent films, later television and movies were made about Harry, each ebbing further from the source. The story, Harry's life, and the Wild West came to rest, concluding by a large rock in the middle of a grain field in eastern Washington, where Harry took his last refuge. Being surrounded by a posse and being mortally wounded, Harry Tracy shot himself.
Tragic fate befalls noted Oregon outlaw. Tracy's exit. Desperado dies by own hand. Shots fired by pursuing posse had broken the leg and severed an artery, and death was inevitable. Crowd of relic seekers strips the body of gory souvenirs.
There was no burial ceremony for Harry Tracy, and he was best eulogized by Joseph D. Lee, superintendent of the Oregon State Penitentiary, in his biennial report, 1902.
With a reputation for crime only, while yet a young man, his sun set in darkness, and his remains lie unhonored in a prison cemetery.
But Harry Tracy's life began in Wisconsin, Pittsville, Wisconsin.
Welcome to Pittsville, Wisconsin,
where he was born with the name Harry Severance. Part 2. Harry who?
Harry Tracy.
Ultimately, it became an irrelevant fact, Harry's real name. It was Tracy who became infamous.
He took his last name, Tracy, from a neighbor of his. Tracy.
No, Tracy was Harry's middle name. Adopted Tracy as his last name to protect his family's good name, Severance. The place of his birth has never been definitely determined, but it was reasonably certain that it was either Louisville, Kentucky, or Dutchess County, New York. Harry was born along the Hudson River, not far from Newburgh. Born in the little hamlet of Dodge City, Kansas. Believed to be born in Poughkeepsie. Connection to the notorious Deer Creek Gang. Terrorized Cincinnati about 15 years ago, but his early days were spent in New York.
Harry Tracy's given name and place of birth were repeatedly misreported and flat-out fictionalized in deficit of actual and easily verifiable information.
Extreme cruelty marked Tracy even as a boy. No ordinary outlaw. Tracy fails to walk into trap fixed for him.
Sensationalistic stories created for market appeal abounded in the newspapers at the time and in dime novels for decades. When Harry Tracy was incarcerated in the Oregon State Prison, Harry reportedly wrote home faithfully, maintaining correspondence with his mother and soliciting his well-placed grandfather, James Quick Severance, for help getting him released from prison, but to no avail. Difficult to believe that the authorities did not know, if not quickly learn, his real name, Harry Severance. But it was common for criminals to be incarcerated under an assumed name, or names. Stuart H. Holbrook verifiably gave Harry Tracy's correct birth date and place, writing in the 1930s. Harry was from Wisconsin.
Wisconsin!
Pittsville, Wisconsin.
Welcome to Pittsville,
where Harry Tracy was born. Harry Severance, the son of Orlando and Sarah Severance, who were married January 12, 1873. Harry had a younger brother, Irvy, who was known as a delinquent, and a younger sister who died as a youth. Sarah, Harry's mother, was an Atkinson, an affluent family from Sturgeon Bay.
Oh, Harry was thoughtful of his mother.
Emma Goodwin Smith, a childhood friend of Harry's.
Especially when his little sister, when she died.
Interviewed in 1977.
Harry's mother was a mean woman,
Very stern-looking.
Minnie DeRoser, also interviewed in 77.
She was a big fat woman. She was a terrible jealous type.
Harry consistently wrote his mother from prison and made the same effort, even when on the run. July 3rd, 1902. Almost a month after Tracy shot his way out of the Oregon State Prison.
Sensational outbreak at the state prison.
Harry held a hostage, a Miss Van Horn, an older woman, at 5011 Finney Avenue Northwest.
I'd never held up a woman before.
Escaped convict and blood-soaked bandit asked Miss Van Horn, his elderly hostage, if she would write to his aunt.
They will be sorry to hear I've been doing such things, but I had to.
To inform his mother.
Tell my mother I am now at liberty.
Many residents remember Harry as a bright and intelligent boy.
Read a Pittsville paper in 1902. In 1934, in the Portland Oregonian, a schoolmate had described Harry as
a dull yahoo who stood practically at the bottom of his class and skipped school whenever he dared.
When Harry was a young teen, his father, Orlando, a logger, abandoned the family.
Orlando left because his wife was a big domineering woman who drove him away.
Orlando ran off with funds he'd collected as an elected treasurer in an effort to build a local school.
Oh, he took a wagon load of vegetables and a team of oxen. He headed for Superior, farther north. He never returned.
Later, while working as a section foreman on the railroad in Kansas, Orlando was using a rail pushcart and was killed by an oncoming train.
Benefit of Mrs. Severance, the lady whose husband was killed on the Santa Fe a few mornings since. He left neither property nor money.
Harry spent considerable time with his grandfather, James Quick Severance. James Quick was an early settler of Wisconsin, arriving 1849. He'd served in the Civil War and then was a justice of the peace for about 20 years, was on the Pittsville Town Board, and was also the town clerk. Just a month before James Quick Severance died, July 1902, a venerable and respected citizen, his grandson Harry had become infamous in his fourth jailbreak.
Tracy ends his own life, uses his gun to cheat the gallows.
The family worked hard to keep that news from James Quick. It was common practice for outlaws to change their names or use an alias, a nom de plume or handle. Butch Cassidy was actually Robert Leroy Parker, Harry Longenbaugh the Sundance Kid, and so on. A childhood friend reported that Tracy was his middle name, but he possibly took the name from a man he'd worked for as a youth, Mike Tracy, a neighbor of Harry's parents, who does appear in the 1895 census. Regardless, Harry Severance became Harry Tracy, the name he gave at his first recorded encounter with law enforcement.
Harry stole $2.
We're never sure that he stole the $2, but he did.
And then he went into town,
Did want and went to town.
got in a bar fight, and badly hurt a guy. When taken to court, his name was Harry Tracy. Pleaded self-defense. Cleared of the charge.
Oh, he was cleared of the charges, and then Harry, he went west.
I am Tracy.
As a youth, Harry had worked as a camp cook and then a logger. Shortly after that, on the railroad in Wisconsin, and travel west he did. Hollis B. Foltz, billed as a veteran criminologist and newsman, writing in 1956 for the Spokesman Review.
Tracy first came into the news on the West Coast following an unsolved murder on First Avenue in Seattle, 1896, a time when Tracy was a student fireman of the Northwest Pacific Railroad. While on the run, Tracy continually declared he had deep contacts in Seattle.
Don't worry about that, buddy. In Seattle, I'm among friends. They can't catch me in Seattle.
New Tracy Whale!
Frank Donnelly, former foreman of the Union Pacific Railroad.
Worked with him on the railroads in the Northwest, lines out of Seattle, Spokane, and Helena.
The Seattle Post-Intelligencer, July 19th, 1902. Years before Harry Tracy would become the infamous escaped convict holding up homes and terrorizing entire cities, Harry lived and worked in the Northwest. He'd been a logger north of Spokane into the winter of 1896, notably living in a cabin on Loon Lake.
Tracy worked for old man Dunlop, winter of 1896-97.
Archie Swope, retired postmaster at Loon Lake, interviewed in the 1960s for Spokane's Spokesman Review.
Tracy's cabin.
Later became a tourist attraction, complete with boat tours, until it burned down in the late 1920s during a 4th of July celebration. A Loon Lake legend declares that Harry, having an affair with a married woman, was cornered in the cabin at gunpoint.
There he is, get him!
It being winter, the lake being covered in ice, Harry made his escape, running away over the frozen lake in only his union suit. J.W. Dunlop, Harry's employer, declared Harry was still owed wages.
He shows up again, I'll pay him.
Many women would later claim to have been consort to Harry Tracy, and more than a handful to be his wife. The newspapers were constantly eager to link him romantically.
Planned escape, several years. While in prison, Tracy wrote to his wife to send him a revolver and tools inside of a ham.
By the winter of 1897, Harry was in Butte, Montana.
Tracy frequently came in here and was a quiet sort of fellow.
Harry Peterson,
Who would never give off the impression that he was a desperate criminal.
bartender of the M&M Saloon.
He had many friends in the city, and some of them are here now. He used to play the races in the pool rooms frequently when he was here, and he had plenty of money at all times.
Harry later bragged to a captive that he and 2 accomplices had once robbed 5 banks in quick succession.
Yeah, but I had to give up my share to protect my pals.
Historian Stuart Holbrook reported, "For a time, Tracy was a minor stooge in the Powder Springs, or hole-in-the-wall gang, operating along the northern border of Colorado."
Tracy and other gunmen robbed banks and raided ranches throughout 1897. Tracy's base was the notorious Hole in the Wall.
Harry Tracy, mad dog of the wild bunch. Tracy was a cold-blooded fighting machine, a superb marksman, a gunfighter extraordinaire who, in his line, was preeminent.
Only Harry Tracy could match the cold-blooded quality of Kid Curry. If they do take me, they'll have to shoot me from behind, for no man can kill me from the front.
Harry Severance became Harry Tracy, the outlaw, at the end of an era. He was a decade younger than Butch Cassidy, and while they were all wanted men in about the same area at about the same time, and there is lore and printed stories, there is no direct documentation, pictures, arrest records that Harry Tracy knew Butch Cassidy or was a member of the Wild Bunch. Harry Tracy did verifiably run with men who undoubtedly knew Cassidy, men like Judge Bennett, Pat Johnson, Gunplay Maxwell, and likely David Lamb. But Harry Tracy's indelible, unassailable association with the Wild Bunch is not a daring train robbery or a harrowing bank heist. It is the murder of Valentine Hoy.
Valentine Hoy murdered, leader of the law and order crowd. Friends of Valentine Hoy string up his murderers. The murdered man was a prominent ranchman, and his sad ending.
This is Harry Tracy's central connection and indisputable place in the story of the Wild Bunch. It was the brazen murder of Valentine Hoy that would galvanize governors and form posses from 3 states. It was Harry Tracy's bullet that echoed the end of the outlaw trail.
Officers and citizens, hunt the outlaws down!
But the name the Wild Bunch itself was assigned by the Pinkerton Detective Agency to target a loose confederate of sometimes accomplices. Butch Cassidy had proposed the Train Robbers Syndicate, a name to encompass the regional gangs numbering over 200 men that included the likes of Kid Curry, the Sundance Kid, Flat-Nosed George Curry, the Powder Springs Gang, the Robbers Roost Gang, and the Diamond Mountain Boys, to name a few. This famous picture of the core members of the Wild Bunch, taken in Texas after they robbed a bank in Winnemucca, Nevada, proved to be the outlaws' biggest mistake. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was creating modern law enforcement techniques, collecting pictures and building profiles, marking banknotes, tracking money and men. If Harry Tracy had any major or notable scores, train robbing, bank jobs, or any large financially successful crimes, it has eluded the annals of history. Harry Tracy's truly outstanding and violent skills as an outlaw only came to light after he broke out of prison, and then broke out again, and again, and again. A half-century after Tracy's manhunt, Ralph Dudley, vice president of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, declared, "Harry Tracy, by all odds, was the most cunning and dangerous of the whole bad bunch." What is historically verifiable is that on the 8th of July, 1897, Harry Tracy was arrested for breaking into a house owned by Henry B. Smith. July 10th, Justice of the Peace Alfred L. Booth sentenced Harry Tracy to 1 year. July 11th, Harry went to prison for the first time.
In the good old summertime, played by the Edison Military Band.
Part 3. Utah. Prison break. Harry Tracy, now a convict, would spend the summer of 1897 incarcerated in the new state of Utah.
Grover Cleveland signs presidential proclamation.
In 1896, Utah became a state.
January 4th, 1896, Utah Territory joins Union as 45th state.
Convict workers had completed the new state prison 6 years earlier.
Utah State Prison. 500 inmate capacity, 240 cells.
On 180 acres, surrounded by 19-foot-tall stone walls.
January 1896, George N. Dow becomes warden of the Utah State Prison.
And the prison promptly purchased industrial machines and began producing shoes, socks, and clothing, with a $4,000 profit recorded the first year.
Water for the prison at that time was pumped by hand from a nearby ditch into tanks located at the top of the buildings.
Difficult work that took the convicts outside the walls of the prison. Digging ditches to lay water pipe to Parley's Canyon was a primary assignment for the prisoners.
Country up in arms to capture Tracy.
Tracy engineered his first escape from prison, and in doing so, met his first partner in crime, David Lant.
With Lant, Frank Edwards, Harry Tracy, and W.H. Brown escaped from prison. When last seen soon after their escape, the men were in the vicinity of Park City and were making their way eastward.
The Portland Morning Oregonian printed on March 22nd Harry's statement regarding his reasoning for escaping from the Utah State Prison.
"I left because they did not treat me right."
Convicts guilty of misconduct could be punished by the warden under regulations adopted by the Board of Corrections.
"I was breaking rock."
All convicts except those in solitary confinement were required to work 8 hours a day, every day except on holidays and Sundays.
"And the large hammer they gave me to use hurt my hands, which were very tender."
Humanitarian views of the Utah State Prison included mandatory work.
"I asked for a smaller hammer and was refused."
In Utah, prisoner punishment was not as medieval. Punishment by cold water showers or bareback whippings were not allowed, as they would be routine in the Oregon State Penitentiary.
"My hands were bleeding and sore. I declined to work."
As progressive a prison as Utah was,
George N. Dow, thorough disciplinarian yet a kind-hearted, merciful man.
it still employed disciplined cells for incorrigibles, dark holes in the basement.
"They tied me up for 5 days, and I made up my mind to escape."
So Harry Tracy busted out of the Utah State Prison.
Utah State Prison.
With a piece of wood whittled into the shape of a gun.
Wooden gun used to escape.
On October 8, 1897, Tracy was digging an irrigation ditch with 10 other inmates. Amongst them,
W.H. Brown, inmate number 909. Frank Edwards, inmate number 953. David Lant, number 952.
as a pretense to gain the attention of the officer overseeing the work detail, Tracy deliberately broke his shovel handle. When guard John Van Streeter came to inspect the broken shovel, he found Tracy with a gun.
Wooden gun!
One of the shovel strips it stayed down, and an ugly six-shooter came up instead.
The gun Tracy used to escape was actually a whittled piece of wood wrapped in foil.
The escape was one of the most daring in the history of the penitentiary, being effected so quickly and quietly that very few outside the gang in which the men were at work knew anything about it,
declared the Salt Lake Tribune. Bluffing a guard with a wooden gun, the exact same tactic famously employed by the notorious gangster John Dillinger. Jefferson City Post-Tribune, May 9th, 1934.
Harry Tracy cut almost the exact same swath at the turn of the century that John Dillinger is cutting today, and there are so many parallels in their careers as to suggest how Dillinger may die.
March 17, 1895, Thomas Blank, held in Seattle, a multiple state murderer facing the death penalty, had also bluffed his way out of jail with a wooden gun. 7 years before Harry Tracy, Seattle was seized in a similar grip of fear and fascination by the outlaw Thomas Blank.
There is no question that he is a high roller. With him it is liberty and other men's money.
Real name, Michael Hogan Jr., also known as Crazy Mike, Slim Jim, and many other aliases. Thomas released 10 other prisoners when he duped the night jailer with his wooden gun. The replica of a .44 that Thomas Blank fashioned using a steel shank from his shoe was said to be so authentic looking as to fool anyone. The fake gun was later auctioned off in Port Townsend, fetching $6.50. Thomas garnered much the same public fascination, outrage, and appeal as Harry Tracy would 7 years later. 18,000 people arrived to view Thomas Blank's corpse when on display, including one woman who kissed the killer. Detective Edward Cudahy, who arrested Blank and was grazed in the neck by a bullet in the process, would later become Sheriff Edward Cudahy and lead the manhunt for Harry Tracy. But that would be in a few years, in Portland, in Seattle, and all around Washington State. After Tracy's violent breakout from the Oregon State Prison, his fourth and most bloody escape.
Well, I am Tracy.
But in his first prison break in Utah, Harry didn't shoot anyone with his wooden gun. Perhaps the best description of Harry Tracy and David Lant's escape and their ensuing flight from the Utah State Penitentiary, it is a poem penned in Tracy's own hand and given to Sheriff Charlie Neiman while Harry was incarcerated.
Echoing the outlaw poet Black Bart, Harry left behind Doggerel.
Doggerel, coarsely written boastful rhyme left behind to taunt the law.
He is out for notoriety, and not at all for gain. He may arrest a schoolboy, or pull a hobo from a train. We left the Salt Lake Pen as the sun was setting low, and we walked along the railroad tracks until our legs refused to go. But we struck Park City early when the morning sunbeams lit on our striped pantaloons where the happy party sit. It's there that we took refuge in some jungles which stood there, and watched the brave policemen while around us they did tear. It's there that we ate our lunches and our weary limbs did rest, until the sun was sinking in the far and distant west. When we started on our journey for our home they call the Wall, where very few detectives ever dare to call. Yours with kind love and best wishes, Harry Tracy.
It was Harry Tracy who had enlisted or simply included David Lant in the escape from the Utah State Prison. Harry who had produced the gun.
Well, I am Tracy.
Harry Tracy is vicious and sullen, with a very forbidding face and looks the typical criminal.
Gentlemen, I am Tracy, and I want something to eat. Quick.
Tracy was now a convict, on the run, and far from home.
And I want you to tell me where all these roads go.
David Lant, however, was a well-known local.
David Lant does not look like a criminal.
The Vernal Express. David Barnabas Lant came from a prominent pioneer family with deep community ties.
David Lant is a boy born and raised here who has failed to accept the good advice from his father.
Mormon church records show David Lant's baptism at the age of 8 on December 7th, 1882.
Lant was raised in Payson, has given his relatives, who are good people, much sorrow.
And his mother dying on August 6th, 1888, when David was 13. As a youth, Lant would herd sheep at the John Reeder Ranch, where a ranch hand named Walt McCoy remembered,
David Lant? Well, he was a good boxer. He used to mix it up with all the local ranch hands.
the Exchange Saloon. The year before, Lant had smashed a bottle across the head of owner James McNaughton. Co-proprietor William McCaslin shot at Lant 3 times, hitting him once.
David Lant, sheep herder, acknowledges self in wrong, put in his own language.
Oh, I went there to get in a row, and I got it. When Tracy and Lant made their break in Utah, Lant had done a single month of an 8-year prison sentence.
Lant broke into the Cook Brothers General Mercantile Store in Woodruff, August 19, 1897, stealing underclothes, shirts, shoes, hats, gloves, ties, and tie pins.
Warden George N. Dow offered a $50 bounty for each escaped convict and put together a 3-man posse that included himself and 2 prison guards. Why Harry Tracy, a man sentenced to a single year at his prison, would take such drastic action as to escape. Warden Dow declared,
Harry must have had a very grave crime lurking in his past.
Summit County gathered another 6-man posse and reportedly searched all night.
A lot of experience, but no convicts.
W.H. Brown and Frank Edwards were caught quickly.
Officers and citizens hunt the outlaws down.
Back in Vernal, horse thieving was now suddenly abundant.
6 horses stolen. They were taken from a schoolhouse where they had been ridden by school children.
Sheriff William Preece.
Sheriff Preece and 2 deputies were out all night Monday hunting for David Lant.
Struck the Atwood Ranch House, known friends to David Lant. David and Harry hid in the cellar.
I have not seen any such men.
The sheriff and posse raided 3 houses of friends of Lance, but were unable to find him.
Leaving the Vernal area, they stopped at another friend of David Lant's, Walt McCoy, who ran a sheep camp on Pot Creek. Tracy sent me down for some food. He's up there in the rocks, watching me, and I'd like to get away from him.
Just go back and tell him to stick his head up, and I'll kill the S.O.B.
Well, I'm afraid if I crossed Tracy, he'd kill me. As escaped convicts, now newly anointed in the newspapers as desperados, dangerous and desperate men, Harry Tracy and David Lant headed for the Outlaw Trail.
The Outlaw Trail!
Arguably, it extends from Canada to Mexico, but the term primarily refers to a series of isolated and natural sanctuaries, outlaw hideouts, at the nexus of Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming.
Countless times the officers have pursued the desperados to this place, and bloody battles have ensued, in which outlaws and officers have given up their lives.
The rugged and remarkably diverse, unsettled land blurred the state borders, and official jurisdictions became hard to judge. Vast place with names like Hole in the Wall, Robber's Roost, Powder Springs, and Brown's Hole. Brown's Hole, an isolated mountain valley, is better known now as Brown's Park.
No single location in the West, and certainly none on the Outlaw Trail, has such a varied history as Brown's Park.
At the time Harry Tracy and David Lant arrived, so many outlaws were floating through the area that their numbers strained a long-standing relationship of tacit neutrality shared with the surrounding citizenry.
There had always been cattle thieves in that section. Stockmen marked off a certain percentage each year as an expected hazard of their business. But with so many rustlers concentrated in one area, herds of from 100 to 500 head were run off at a time. Thieves conducted regular roundups. In a short time, there was scarcely a steer left on the range.
The law comes to Brown's Hole. Or the cattlemen who stood for law and order had served warning on the outlaws that they would come in full strength, if necessary, to collect their stolen herds, killing any man who stood in their way. The wild bunch knew the ranchers like the Hoy brothers. They were not boasting.
David Lant and Harry Tracy would continue to make headlines. Together they would be captured and escape 2 more times.
News of the West!
And when cornered, Harry would shoot a prominent rancher named Valentine Hoy.
Trial of Lant and Tracy!
A killing so consequential it shaped the end of the Wild Bunch.
Governors to confer! Border outlaws the theme.
James Hoy, rancher, largest local real estate holder, and later member of the Wyoming Territorial Legislature. Desperados, who are now in New Mexico this winter, maybe in the wilds of Montana next winter, paying this section a visit on their way, terrorizing the people, robbing the camps, and stealing horses en route. They are migratory criminals.
Here today, there tomorrow, changing their names as they change their locality. Reward of $1,000 apiece, dead or alive, offered by the authorities of 3 states, Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah.
Part 4. Murder. This Harry Tracy and David Lant escaped from the Utah pen last fall and have been on the move ever since. A few days in a place and fear of capture forces them to move on and keep moving. Justice of the Peace, James H. Hoy.
The Hoy brothers, leaders of the law and order crowd.
James Hoy was the brother of Valentine S. Hoy, who would later be murdered by Harry Tracy. Deputy U.S. Marshal Perry L. Young encountered Harry Tracy and David Lant on December 2nd by Taylor Mountain.
Look into Winchester's thrilling experience of Deputy Marshal Young. David Lant, an escapee from the state prison, and 2 comrades stand up to the officer near Vernal.
Freshly escaped from prison, Harry Tracy and David Lant became cornered in the Lodore Canyon of the Browns Hole area of Colorado.
Harry Tracy and David Lant, members of the Powder Springs gang of outlaws.
Their big mistake was meeting up with a couple other outlaws, Pat Johnson and Judge Bennett. Judge Bennett was not a real judge. His name was Jack, and he'd met Butch Cassidy in prison. We never considered that he belonged to the Cassidy gang proper. The number of outlaws operating from these headquarters variously estimated from 50 to 500. He was a member of the hanger-on gang that followed around and got the crumbs after Cassidy and the bunch had cut the loaf. It was with these hanger-on gang members that Tracy and Lant joined forces, 2 of the most marginal members of the Wild Bunch. Pat Johnson and Judge Bennett wanted for the recent shooting of a young man named Willie Strang, the first of several murders that would shake the community. Judge Bennett was selected to meet back up with Johnson and Lant and Tracy near Douglas Mountain. It was decided that it was best if it was Bennett who went for supplies. There was an open warrant for Bennett and Johnson both on cattle rustling, but it was Johnson who had just shot young Willie Strang at the ranch house of a local named Valentine Hoy. Willie Strang, a playful teen, pulled a chair out from underneath Johnson, a prank he'd pulled before. Johnson, out of anger or his own idea of a prank, pulled out his pistol and put a bullet in the boy's spine. Willie died soon after. Valentine Hoy led the posse of men that came looking for Pat Johnson, and he found David Lant and Harry Tracy as well.
Browns Park, Utah, February 20th, 1898. Dear Sir, I have just received word that Willie Strang was shot last Tuesday morning by one P.L. Johnson at my ranch on Red Creek, Wyoming.
These excerpts from a letter written by Valentine Hoy in his own hand.
The killing was a cold-blooded affair, and no expense should be spared to punish Pat Johnson for the cowardly deed.
The letter was written just 9 days before Harry Tracy gunned Valentine Hoy down.
One John Bennett is supposed to be in his company. This John Bennett is wanted. He stole the boy's horse after they killed him. The body has been prepared for burial, awaits a coroner's inquest, and wishes of the boy's parents. The people over here are around to immediate action to rid the country of these desperate characters. Yours truly, Valentine S. Hoy.
Almost 50, Valentine was the oldest of 4 local brothers and 1 sister. Hoy was a Civil War veteran with the Union Army, a rancher, a miner, and a cattleman. Valentine declared he wanted no business with Harry or Lant, but he was determined to bring Johnson to justice. Harry Tracy wasn't having any of it.
Stop where you are, Hoy. You come one step closer and I will kill you, deader than hell.
Hoy would not back down.
Johnson shot Willie Strang, and we're gonna hang him higher than a kite.
You are not gonna take Johnson or anyone else.
Keep out of this, Tracy. It's none of your affair.
Hoy kept coming, and Harry shot him.
Harry Tracy, a bad man,
It was Harry Tracy's bullet
but a great shot.
that set off a series of events ending the safe havens of the Outlaw Trail.
The region near the center of which the corners of Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming come together has recently been the scene of bold and desperate deeds of outlawry that have excited great indignation in all 3 of the states named. The murder of the boy Strang and the more recent killing in cold blood of Hoy are crimes that call for swift vengeance.
The walls of Lodore Canyon rise 2,000 feet on the both sides of the Green River. The mountains are precipitous. He was there, under the shadow of that great rock, for 48 hours.
An awful murder has been committed here today. V.S. Hoy was shot dead by a party of outlaws and murderers in the rocks of Lodore Canyon. He lies where he fell.
It was impossible to bring the dead man's body down the way he went up.
This strip of country is rugged and broken and almost impregnable by a stranger and abounds in caves, deep gorges, and strongholds from which it is impossible to dislodge the outlaws who have trails unknown to any except themselves.
James Hoy.
Hunting men in a thickly settled country or on the plains or open country is one thing, but to hunt them in these mountains, snow-capped in sections the year round, cut by impassable canyons, unfordable rivers, gulches, gullies, and where nearly every section of land affords a hiding place is another proposition.
James Hoy's point about the familiarity of the terrain was as salient as it would be later when tracking Tracy in the great woods of the Northwest.
Might as well just send a lot of schoolboys to do the work, or get lost, or killed themselves. If these outlaws are to be gotten rid of, it will be done by men living here, or men knowing the country and acting in concert with resident citizens of good reputation.
The citizens of Browns Park have made up their minds that section shall no longer be used by criminals and fugitives from justice as a hiding place.
More than 60 legally sworn in and armed men swarmed the hills on horseback, all on the hunt for the men who murdered Valentine Hoy. Most unfortunately for Judge Bennett, he was oblivious. When he arrived at Douglas Mountain, he discharged his pistol 3 times, a signal to meet back with Johnson, Lant, and Tracy. But he was captured and taken to the Bassett Ranch house.
Mommy, look at the funny men.
Josie Bassett McKnight and her small son Crawford watched as 7 men with hastily made masks lynched a struggling Judge Bennett.
An outlaw lynched
He weakened when the mob took him and begged piteously. Bennett was so handy with a gun that he thought that no man or set of men dared to attempt to arrest him. Deward Campbell. They stood him up in a springboard buggy, put the noose around his neck. The drop was too short to break Bennett's neck, and for 3 or 4 minutes he danced, a lively jig in midair, gyrating and pirouetting grotesquely. Then there was one less troublemaker in Brown's Park. The shooting of young Willie Strang, the murder of respected rancher Valentine Hoy, the lynching of Judge Bennett, and the formation of posses from 3 different states brought an abundance of publicity. The gang of outlaws now pursued by the posse is a small detachment of the greatest organized band of thieves and murderers ever rendezvoused in the West. In actuality, the 3 freezing fugitives had managed one scant meal from the one horse they'd stolen away with, cutting its hide into strips to reinforce their worn-out shoes, their bleeding feet leaving tracks in the snow. Joe Davenport, a member of the posse, later recalled,
Tracy and Lant ran ahead, but Johnson, cowardly to the core, turned and walked towards us with his hands raised.
Tracy and Lant holed up in a small, snow-filled gulch. So hopeless was the situation that Lant threw up his hands in defeat.
Well,
and began to surrender to the posse.
hell! Lance started to surrender. Tracy pulled his gun on him and threatened to kill him.
You get back here, you son of a bitch, or I will blow your head off.
The standoff persisted, deadlocked. The wind grew, the cold set in.
But finally, both submitted to the inevitable and threw up their hands.
If my partners had stayed with me, the officers would have killed us, or we would have frozen to death right here.
Extra! Extra! Details of the capture!
Gents, give me a cup of coffee, a fresh horse, and 25 yards head start, and I won't bother you no more.
James Hoy convened a preliminary hearing at the nearby Bassett Ranch House. It was March 5th, 1889.
Which one of you killed my brother?
Well, one of us here did it.
The 3 outlaws and murderers of Valentine S. Hoy and Willie Strang are captured and lodged in jail according to law.
Harry Tracy and David Lant were being held at Hans Peak Jail in separate cells, but not for long. On March 4th, 1889, they escaped. Harry Tracy asked Sheriff Neiman, who'd been part of the posse, for a match before stepping into his cell. David Lant, whose door had been left open, or Lant knew how to spring it, beat Sheriff Neiman senseless, and then he released Harry Tracy.
Harry Tracy and David Lant escape Hans Peak, beat Sheriff Neiman.
The 2 stripped, bound, and gagged Neiman, and then left with the keys. Neiman, badly beaten, was a determined man himself and declared he was not too hurt to join the posse, then mounting to hunt for the fugitives yet again. South of Steamboat Springs, Tracy and Lant, 2 unarmed, freezing fugitives, discarded 2 stolen and tired horses, then hailed the Hans Peak to Walcott Daily sleigh, passing in the dim light of the breaking morning, and they climbed aboard. There they found a revolver pointed squarely at them, and behind it, the blackened eyes and still bloodied face of Sheriff Neiman.
Sheriff Neiman, I would not have thought you'd have been up this early.
Sheriff Neiman and his deputy, Milby Frazier, bought chains and padlocks and chained his prisoners by the neck. Harry Tracy and David Lant were transferred to Aspen to be lodged in the Pinkton County Jail. On April 10th, the Aspen Times reported,
The outlaws are 2 about as desperate-looking men as Pinkton County's jail has ever harbored. The jail is one of the most secure in the state and will be next to an impossibility for a prisoner to escape from it without receiving help from the outside, which, of course, will be carefully guarded against.
and the Aspen Times was quickly proven wrong. Shortly after 5 p.m. on June 22nd, David Lant struck Aspen jailer Bob Jones in the head with an iron poker. Jones, who also worked as the courthouse janitor,
Hey, I held my own in that fight, and it took Tracy joining in to best me.
Tracy and David Lant, escaped convicts from Utah, had more nerve.
Harry Tracy and David Lant had escaped for the third time.
Tracy and Lant are desperate men, and Sheriff Fisher is fortunate indeed that he was not shot down.
There remains no substantiation of what became of David Lant past his headlining exploits with Harry Tracy. After that, David Lant effectively disappeared. No death was ever recorded and no body ever found. He left behind only lore. Stories like David was shot by Tracy before they parted ways, or that Lant later became a war hero, or that he served a long prison sentence under another name. The book The Vanished Outlaw presents a strong case that David Lant went on to live a long and quiet life under an assumed alias, David Stillwell. Stillwell. The point is germane in consideration to what is reported to have happened to Harry Tracy's next partner in Portland, Oregon, David Merrill. Merrill, who Tracy would report he shot in a private duel, was found weeks later, a corpse with no face.
The face is unrecognizable.
100 years of Browns Park and Diamond Mountain documents compelling material declaring that David Lant survived as a quiet loner, leaving behind an estate consisting of a sheep wagon, a 4-horse team, and 2 saddles when he, then named David Stillwell, died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound May 4th, 1947. Harry Tracy went west, broke incarceration a 4th time, became the subject of a massive manhunt, then died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound.
Bad man Tracy does bloody work. Last of the Western bad men.
Part 5. Portland.
Harry Tracy.
After escaping the Utah State Pen with his wooden gun, and then shooting down rancher Valentine Hoy, and violently escaping from behind bars 2 more times, Tracy robbed the Exchange Saloon in Billings, Montana.
The Exchange Saloon, Billings, Montana. P.H. Scally, proprietor, held up in his own place of business.
I was robbed of a fine gold watch besides about $82 in cash, which was in the money drawer.
The Billings Gazette, September 20th, 1898. A man named Edward M. Kelly was sentenced to 5 years for robbing the Exchange Saloon. The evidence was the fine gold watch. Kelly had produced it after being told that P.H. would buy rounds of champagne on return of the watch.
I'd buy rounds of champagne anyone returned my fine gold watch.
Edward Kelly returned the watch and was arrested for the theft. Harry Tracy heard about it. Harry wrote a letter of clarification and admission of guilt while incarcerated in Oregon, and it was forwarded by the warden to clear Kelly of the charge.
I, Harry Tracy, robbed the Exchange Saloon and gave to him, Kelly, a watch which I got from the bartender. It was in September when I robbed the saloon. I don't know the date, but it was just before the county fair. If the man is not outright, and I will give a satisfactory description of the crime so as to leave no doubt that I did it. Kelly was a stranger to me and did not know who robbed the saloon. I heard him say the bartender was a friend of his, and he also said he would give me $15 for the watch just to give it back to the bartender. I gave him the watch and left for Dickinson.
Controversy stirred by the letter prompted Montana Governor Robert Burns Smith to grant a full pardon, releasing Edward M. Kelly from prison. Freeing someone of a charge he himself claimed to have committed is emblematic of the noble outlaw ethos Harry Tracy outspokenly would align himself with. Or perhaps Harry just liked being obstinate, as he would later declare in open court.
I'll plead guilty to everything, and it'll make little difference to me whether I did it or not.
Harry would repeatedly declare that he had deep ties in Seattle.
I have friends in Seattle who will help me. I'll hold up Clancy's gambling house or some such place. I must have money, and I know how to get plenty of it.
Once in Washington state, Harry Tracy would drift through Tacoma and Olympia, down to Portland and Oregon, robbing more bartenders, streetcar conductors, and small businessmen, meeting up with a new partner in crime in Portland, David Merrill.
David Merrill was always a problem child.
Herb Carroll, Cowlitz County pioneer. As a teen, David was arrested in Portland for stealing a suit of clothes and $40. November 30th, 1887, he was sentenced to 90 days in the Portland jail, and David Merrill was already making news.
The parents have done what they could to reform the lad, but he seems incorrigible.
3 years later, January 10th, 1890, Merrill was again arrested in Portland, this time for robbing a store. David was given 3 years in the Oregon State Penitentiary, entering the prison on January 30th, 1890, and released on September 2nd, 1892. That would be David Merrill's first incarceration in the Oregon State Penitentiary. The second would end with him and Harry Tracy shooting their way to freedom.
Sensational outbreak at the state prison. Harry Tracy and David Merrill. 3 guards killed by 2 desperate convicts.
David Merrill was born in Cowlitz County, Washington, the southwest corner of the state on the Columbia River. The Columbia is the border between Oregon and Washington. David had extended family and deep criminal ties across the Northwest, including Portland and Seattle. Very possibly, Harry Tracy and David Merrill had known each other for years, from the time Harry had lived in the Northwest.
They were in the city in 1899 and spent a good part of their time in Tacoma and Olympia.
The Seattle Post-Intelligencer. There is an often printed tale of them meeting in a bar in Portland, David Merrill being in dispute with a loud man threatening to get violent. This pulpish version from The Wild Bunch by James D. Horan.
It was a spring night in 1898 when Tracy walked into a combination saloon and dance hall. "Whiskey," he said to the bartender, and placed his money on the bar. As the whiskey filled the glass, he heard loud voices behind him. Curious, he turned and saw a big drunken lumberman shaking his fist at a smaller man who was obviously a gambler. "You cheap tin horn!" the drunken man was shouting. "You rigged that deck!" the gambler said. "You're drunk." The lumberman went at him with a knife. With cat-like ease, Tracy stepped in between the lumberman and the gambler with a short shoulder blow, spun the bigger man across the table. As he started to struggle to his feet, shouting threats and curses, Tracy calmly kicked him in the face. He slid back, unconscious. At the table, the gambler rose and shook his cuffs nervously. He turned to the man in the dark blue suit, his hand outstretched. "Thanks, that damn fool might have cut me. My name's David Merrill." The man in blue smiled with strong, irregular teeth against his square, tan face. His eyes were gray and deep-set.
I am Tracy. Harry Tracy.
Portland was a major port in the Pacific Northwest, the Willamette and Columbia Rivers lending the city access to the Pacific Ocean and a global market for the ample amount of timber produced by the region. As much as Portland was emerging as a city of Victorian charm, new wealth, and rapid bicycle sales, Portland was still rightfully reputed as one of the most dangerous port cities in the world.
Portland, the most filthy city in the northern states,
the Oregonian reported in 1889. But the unsanitary sewers and gutters it reported on were a sliver of the unseemly side of the city. The waterfront was ripe with actual danger. The saloons and boarding houses catering to the sailors and other working-class people had a rightful reputation as a place where robbery, abduction, and violence were commonplace. In Portland, Harry Tracy made quick the transition from rural range outlaw to urban holdup man.
The False-Face Bandits.
For some of the holdups, Tracy and Merrill liked to wear masks. The False-Face Bandits, brutish and petty crime, scraping out a living, gaining a minor reputation for fleecing civilians and saloons. Tracy and Merrill robbed the 2nd Street trolley car, collecting citizens' assorted valuables, took the conductor's watch. Plumber's drugstore, they bound and gagged the clerk and stole postage stamps. At Russell's saloon, they tied Russell's hands behind his back and gagged him with a bar towel. They robbed Magoo's saloon, Jennings' place, Otto Neusler's saloon, Way's butcher shop, Barrett's butcher shop, and a grocer named Offner.
Police received information.
Maybe it was David Merrill's own drunken loud mouth, bragging at the local bars of his success.
Authorities came to know.
Be it an account of fine work by the Portland police or some snitch, authorities came to know where the Desperados could be found, a residence well known to the authorities and reputed to fence stolen goods.
Mother Merrill's house, Market Street and 1st.
Mother Merrill was an invention of the newspaper. David's mother's last name was Robinson, and she lived in Vancouver. Police surveillance showed David Merrill and Harry Tracy were using the house as a headquarters. Reports were that the older woman at the home when it was raided,
woman identified as Mrs. Merrill,
was the one who gave David Merrill's hiding place away to the police.
Merrill, a man of a mere 100 pounds, was found earlier having folded himself into the bottom drawer of a chest of drawers.
5'11" and 100 pounds. David was armed with a .45 when found folded in the bottom drawer. He surrendered without incident.
Merrill gave information which led to the capture of his accomplice.
Did David Merrill give information to the police? Did he set up Harry Tracy? Or was David belligerent, uncooperative, and unaware? This is a pivotal point of contention amongst authors, historians, and newspaper reports. The full import of this controversy would later be magnified after their escape from the Oregon State Penitentiary.
Hand and foot of convict Merrill's body projected above 2 fallen trees. Body identified to be Merrill.
After a body was found in the woods, full of bullet holes.
Warden Janes will not swear that it is convict.
I do not believe it was Merrill's body that was brought back to the penitentiary.
The face is unrecognizable.
But back in Portland, outside Mother Merrill's house, Harry Tracy was about to get arrested. Detective Weiner approached Harry Tracy, attempting to engage in conversation. Harry was recognizable from a distance as he was wearing his black Macintosh trench coat and matching wide-brimmed hat. Harry was instantly suspicious and kept walking. At 4th and Market Street, a Southern Pacific train. See that train? I guess I'll be taking it.
I guess you will not.
As Detective Weiner went to draw his weapon, 2 bullets barely missed his head. On the train, Tracy pointed his revolver at the conductor.
Highball it, buddy, or you're a dead man.
The engineer pulled the cord on the brake system instead.
I'm sorry, sir, but control of this train has passed out of my hands.
Tracy jumped from the train, heading up Harrison Street. But emerging from the gathering crowd was Albert Way.
Albert Way, son of Butcher,
with a shotgun. Young Albert was the son of one of the butchers who'd been robbed by Merrill and Tracy. Albert shot at Harry from some distance, hitting him in the back of the head with a loaded birdshot, leaving a superficial wound. Shot and staggering, Harry attempted to flee but fell over a fence directly into the yard of a Portland policeman named Ephraim J. Wilkinson, who, along with Detective Weiner, arrested Harry Tracy.
Harry Tracy and David Merrill.
On March 21st, 1899, Harry Tracy and David Merrill were set to go to trial. Harry was being led down a corridor of the jail to the courtroom itself by jailer James Dodery, and Harry produced a gun. "Oh, it won't do you any good to kill me, Harry," Dodery reasoned with Harry. Deputy Sheriff Thomas A. Jordan.
Deputy Sheriff Thomas A. Jordan.
Concerned about the delay of Tracy's appearance in the courtroom, then discovered Harry in the corridor with the gun trained on jailer Dodery.
"Throw up your hands, Tracy. Throw 'em up."
Tracy fired at Jordan and missed.
Several shots exchanged.
The sheriff returned fire, 2 shots in response. Either bullets were close enough for Tracy to give up, or the alternate story that he lost grip of his weapon is true. Either way, Harry relented.
Planned escape.
All right, I surrender, gentlemen.
Harry Tracy was finally marched into the courtroom, and the escape was added to his sentence. He was given 5 concurrent 20-year terms in the Oregon State Penitentiary. Harry's conduct in court.
Harry Tracy became somewhat boastful and in vainglorious manner.
I'll plead guilty to everything, and it'll make little difference to me whether I did it or not.
The prediction is made that before Tracy is in the penitentiary 5 years, he will be shot to death by a guard for attempting to escape, or he will commit murder again to regain his liberty.
Part 6. Prison. Escape. When Harry Tracy entered the Oregon State Penitentiary to do a 20-year sentence, he stated his occupation as a cook. He had previously worked as a cook when a kid in the logging camps of Wisconsin.
In conversation with him, he was very direct, and although devoid of much education, he had a good use of language.
Joseph D. Lee, a political appointee of Governor T.T. Gear, served as superintendent of the Oregon State Penitentiary when Tracy and Merrill made their break.
Since my contact with criminals and my study of related subjects commencing in 1894 when I became an officer in the municipal court of the city of Portland, I have not met a man with so many strong points as to qualify him for a successful criminal career as Harry Tracy.
Well, I am Tracy.
Prison officials noted that Tracy had deep-set blue eyes, and that his upper jaw had been broken, and that his front teeth were in a state of decay, that he measured 5'8" 3/4, had a hat size of 7 1/8, and a shoe size of 7.
His quickness of apprehension and decision was Napoleonic. He had a nerve of steel.
Superintendent Lee wrote in his 1902 biennial report,
"With him, the taking of a human life was the question of expedience only."
Extra edition. Tracy shoots down several pursuers. Fought like a wild beast at bay. Sheriff Cudahy returns to Seattle. Disgusted.
T.T. Gear's predecessor, a Republican, William Payne Lord, inaugurated Oregon's 9th governor in January 1895. Lord was a vocal proponent of prison reform, but not rehabilitation, rather discipline, security, and economic management of the prisoners and facility.
To ease the taxpayers' burden imposed by misfits and failures.
On March 11, 1895, A.N. Gilbert, a Republican ally of Governor Lord, assumed his duties as superintendent of the Oregon State Penitentiary and was committed to similar prison reforms as Governor Lord. As a reformer, Gilbert was an adamant defender of corporal punishment.
Not a single case of insubordination or serious trouble of any kind has occurred.
Enforced discipline and fortification of the physical prison itself became the Gilbert administration's main function of reform, quickly identifying the decaying wooden structures as blatant fire hazards.
Were a fire started in the basement, the prison would go up like a tinderbox, and every prisoner would be cremated.
In 1897, then superintendent for several years, Gilbert officially stated his analysis of conditions of the Oregon State Penitentiary in his biennial report.
During the period of my incumbency as superintendent, I have traveled to some extent, and I have made it my business to visit the penal institutions of 7 other states, and I must say that I feel somewhat humiliated in being forced to the admission that Oregon has the poorest on the line of conveniences, sanitary conditions, furniture, appliances, buildings, and everything.
T.T. Gear, Oregon's 10th governor.
Gear has a wheel. Governor-elect learned to ride in 2 lessons.
was the first governor to be born in the state of Oregon, also publicly dedicated to prison reform, as he clearly pronounced in his inaugural address.
It now costs between $8 and $10 to take a prisoner from the Marion County Courthouse to prison, while an attendant from that institution could do the same work for 15 cents.
It was T.T., or Theodore Thurston, who was governor when Harry Tracy and David Merrill violently escaped, killing 3 guards.
Sensational outbreak at the state prison.
Theodore Thurston, who had appointed Joseph D. Lee superintendent to the Oregon State Prison to reform the institution.
Laxity in discipline is a mistaken kindness to prisoners. It invites insubordination and attempts to escape, which usually result in the loss of life.
A detective named Joseph Day reported that water torture was a tactic frequently employed at the penitentiary. The miserable victim is stripped to the waist, handcuffed to the wall with his arms outstretched. A powerful stream of water was then turned on him, tearing, bruising, and all but drowning the poor unfortunate. No wonder they cringed and defied the guards to shoot. The governor authorized to contract and lease the labor of the inmates in order to assist in the funding of the institution. A labor contract with Goldsmith and Lowenberg of the Northwest Foundry Corporation established a stove factory in the prison and employed prison labor, providing much-needed income for the state, and was further touted as therapeutic reform for the inmates.
Idleness amongst the inmates is disastrous to the prisoners' morale and to the public's welfare.
The Oregon State Prison's reputation as a prison in business is particularly highlighted by the development, production, and popularity of the Oregon boot.
Oregon boot is regarded as one of the best and most effective shackles known.
J.C. Gardner, first warden of the Oregon State Penitentiary in 1866, had devised a modern manacle he declared the Gardner Shackle, but it was better known to the world as the Oregon Boot. Tracy was no stranger to the Oregon Boot, having been manacled before in Utah and Colorado.
Tracy murders attributed to revenge for being forced to don heavy boot.
J.C. owned the patent on the Oregon Boot. The shackle had a solid lead core and was nickel-plated. On completion of the prison, the inmates would go on to produce the Oregon Boot in mass, a thick, heavy metal weight that locks around the top of one's ankle.
No one has ever escaped from an Oregon boot.
The Art Burnside Sporting Goods of Spokane became the sole manufacturer of the Oregon Boot, and it was in service till at least 1939 for inmate transport and punishment. Trade publications selling the boot declared,
The only way to get an Oregon boot off is with a key.
Wearing the Oregon Boot, many sustained serious injury, infection, and permanent physical damage. David Merrill was said to have gained a limp from his time in the Oregon Boot. Some inmates would later claim David Merrill's permanent and pronounced injury was not apparent on the faceless corpse determined to be David Merrill when the body was returned to prison.
Body identified to be Merrill. The face is unrecognizable.
Conditions and treatment such as the boot were routine in the penitentiary. Prisoner beatings, floggings, and punishments would commonly escalate to outright execution or default to murder by means of malicious neglect. The blatant brutality of the prison is perhaps felt best in terms of emotional impact by Joseph Kelly in his 1908 published accounts, 13 Years in the Oregon Penitentiary. Bunko, as he self-identifies, is most famous as a prolific Portland crimper. A crimper, someone specializing professionally in Shanghai. Shanghai being the act of abducting often inebriated or otherwise compromised people into compulsory service aboard a boat or ship in sudden servitude.
Sailors be slaves no more.
But Joseph Kelly was never convicted as a crimper. Bunko was convicted for murder.
Bunko Kelly, convicted.
Bunko denied ever attempting to sell opium to G.W. Sayers, denied hacking G.W. to death, and denied throwing Sayers in the Willamette River, declared he'd been set up by rival crimpers.
Bunko Kelly, pardoned after 13 years.
And despite some strong evidence to support his claims of innocence, up the river Bunko went, an inmate at the Oregon State Prison for 13 years. Kelly's accounts are full of brutal men like Charles Sherwood, who was promoted to the deputy warden with the nickname Man of Flogs, or guard Jack Stapleton, dubbed the Jack of Clubs. He did in fact do time with Harry Tracy and David Merrill.
Tracy was known as a gunman.
Harry Tracy and David Merrill, two convicted criminals, previous partners in crime, became cellmates and co-workers assigned to the foundry to toil at hard labor in the molding room together. Making stoves was a highly questioned and debated practice, as 3 years and 77 days later. June 9th, 1902, a Monday morning. Following mandatory chapel, Harry Tracy and David Merrill reported to their usual detail in the prison foundry, making stoves. Secreted amongst their tools and stove patterns, they found two 30-30 Winchesters and several boxes of ammunition.
The guns were placed in the molding room. They did not go there of their own accord.
Bunko gave this account of the breakout.
Guard Farrell was standing near the door rolling a cigarette when Tracy and Merrill picked up the guns and walked up to Farrell. He turned and saw them coming. He threw up his hands.
You had your day, and now it is mine.
Shot the officer without another remark. Tracy and Merrill were taking their time, walking through the shops with a ladder.
Harry shot and killed guard SRT Jones, who was on the wall in charge of the northern post. From a distance of 150 yards, 450 feet, with the first weapon he'd touched in 3 years, a Winchester 30-30 he'd had in his hands moments.
Top of the wall, he began firing like a rapid-fire gun until Merrill climbed up to the top.
Guard B.T. Tiffany and Guard Ross were forced to march in front of the escaping convicts, acting as a human shield for 100 yards as other guards began to fire from the wall. Guard B.T. Tiffany did die in this exchange, and his death is credited to Merrill and Tracy. However, it is possible that friendly fire or a bullet from a gun of another guard is what laid him to rest. Regardless, Harry Tracy and David Merrill were long gone.
He was especially fortunate in having intelligent and shrewd outside help. We kept him much longer than had any other prison.
Superintendent Joseph D. Lee, in his biennial report, wrote a candid account that confirmed the details of Bunko Kelly's story.
There has been but one jail delivery, which occurred on Monday morning, June 9th, 1902, when David Merrill and Harry Tracy escaped from the molding room of the workshops. Of their escape, flight, and death, I will speak somewhat in detail. Their escape was accomplished by outside help. During the preceding night, probably 2 rifles and a good supply of ammunition were secreted with the working tools of these 2 men. Shop guard Frank S. Merrill and wall guards SRT Jones and B.T. Tiffany were fatally shot. Convict Frank S. Ingram received a bullet in his left leg, which necessitated its amputation. The escapees scaled the wall by means of a ladder, which was used for oiling the machinery in the shops. Several shots were fired at them, but the range was long, and they were unhurt.
Trap for posse. Convicts plan to kill their pursuers.
Expected to be caught quickly,
Convicts will soon be killed or captured.
Tracy and Merrill became instantly elusive by doubling back to Salem, arriving at the home of J.W. Roberts.
I just returned home about 10 o'clock last evening from downtown.
J.W. was a resident of Salem.
I presumed there were members of the search party returning home. Hands up and be quiet.
June 10th, 1902, 9:30 a.m., the morning after the breakout, they were in Jervis, about 10 miles north of Salem, holding up 2 returning posse members, Dr. P.S. White and a farmer, stealing their horse and buggy and heading north. That evening, Tracy and Merrill appeared at a woodcutter's named August King.
They were very polite.
Offered to pay any price I wanted for some food. They employed mismakers in the kitchen.
We are the terrible escaped convicts, and we want breakfast.
While in the middle of the meal, the whistle from the nearby sawmill blew, and they both jumped up like rockets.
They had dinner at the residence of E.D. Graves and left with 5 pounds of his bacon. Oregon Governor T.T. Gear called out the militia.
Orders out, state militia! Escaped convicts add other crimes to triple murder. The convicts steal horses in Salem. Bold outlaws mount animals and ride away.
By June 11th, more than 250 militiamen, sheriffs, deputy sheriffs, and newspaper men could not find Harry Tracy or David Merrill. The bloodhounds brought in from Walla Walla, Washington State Penitentiary with much fanfare, and their handler, guard E.M. Carson, prominently featured in the newspapers, failed to produce results. And the Oregonian declared,
Where the convicts are now, no one knows. They may be walking calmly along some country road in eastern Clackamas County, headed for the mountains, or they may be working their way to Portland.
Oregon Prison Superintendent Lee.
I shall never rest until I run the fiends down.
By June 14th, most of the posse retired.
The posse is positive that the men have not crossed the river.
From the stern of the boat, Winchester in his lap.
3 men forced to ferry the escapees across the Columbia.
Harry Tracy gave a casual account of their escape.
I wasn't the least bit afraid of them bloodhounds.
Cayenne pepper dropped in tracks. Put dogs off scent for a time.
Those guards were fools to allow us to climb up that ladder and skin up those walls.
On June 16th, it was reported widely that Tracy and Merrill were now in Washington State.
Outlaw Tracy, very much alive.
On July 1st, at 5 a.m., Tracy appeared on South Bay, Puget Sound, near Capital City Oyster Company, alone.
He is going it alone in the state of Washington.
Tracy was asked where David Merrill was, his fellow escapee and partner in crime.
David Merrill was a no-good coward who had it coming for a long time. I killed that son of a bitch several days ago.
Part 7. Seattle. Seattle is an anglicized pronunciation of a native chief's name. Captain George Vancouver was the first to map the Puget Sound and named it after his second lieutenant, Peter Puget. The name Puget Sound not only refers to the body of water, a deep and sheltered inlet connecting to the Pacific Ocean, but also refers to the region built around it, the cities including Olympia, Tacoma, and Seattle.
Convict Harry Tracy lands near Seattle. Appropriates a gasoline launch at South Bay near Olympia.
Harry Tracy entered the Oyster Company's main house, a shanty on the bank of the Puget Sound. It was also the home of Horatio Ailing, who, along with the camp cook, William Adair, was starting the workday.
Can a man cruise around the Puget Sound in that boat?
Frank Scott, arriving to work, walked into the shanty.
Sure, it's a great boat.
Would it take a fellow to Seattle?
Easy as pie.
How long a trip would it be?
Well, it's about 65 miles. Depending on the tides, weather conditions, it's a 6 to 8 hour cruise.
Then that's where we're going, as soon as I've had breakfast. You got any objection to that?
Harry Tracy. With characteristic daring, he took possession of a gasoline launch belonging to a Seattle man at South Bay near Olympia, forced 4 men who had the craft in charge to navigate it to Meadow Point, some 2 miles north of Ballard, where Tracy disembarked and his shang-eyed crew came to Seattle to tell the story of their thrilling experience with the convict.
The N&S, a large gasoline launch, was tied just outside. Tracy spotted Captain A.J. Clark, owner of the large gasoline launch, the N&S, and his 15-year-old son, Edwin Clark, and forced them into servitude aboard their own ship.
When I entered the house at the oyster plant, I noticed a man with a gun immediately.
Take your hands out of your pockets, Captain. If you have a gun in there, it'll do no use to pull it.
I was taken by surprise.
Are you ready to shoot? If you are, I'm ready for you.
I thought it was a joke that had gone too far. Who are you? I demanded.
I am Tracy.
As the launch containing Harry Tracy and his hostage crew passed McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary, the outlaw asked Captain Clark to pull in as close as possible so that he could kill any guard he saw.
I'm gonna take a crack at one of those guards.
Frank Scott dissuaded Harry of this idea as it might draw attention. The four-man crew of kidnapped victims all later agreed that Tracy talked to Frank Scott the most and was the one that Harry appeared to almost befriend.
While I was mortally afraid of the man, still he made a fella feel at home.
Frank Scott was also the one that asked Harry where David Merrill was.
I shot him in the woods.
Tracy then declared that he and David Merrill had mutually decided on a traditional, back-to-back, take 10 paces, turn and shoot duel.
But he was going to shoot me.
Tracy then professed that he cheated Merrill in the duel, turning early at 8 paces, not 10.
Yeah, what we agreed, was stand back to back, holding our rifles, take 10 paces each, then turn and fire. But I didn't trust him. So when I'd taken 8 steps, I fired a shot over my shoulder, hit him, and knocked him down. Then I walked over to where he was laying on the ground, fired another bullet into him.
The face is unrecognizable.
He was no good, like I said.
Harry Tracy's accounts of the duel, his line of reasoning to kill, and personal opinion of David Merrill varied and conflicted. He told the Fisher family while holding them captive.
I was afraid to trust him anymore. I miss him like hell, though.
While later, Tracy told another hostage, Mrs. R.H. Van Horn.
I never had any love for him anyway.
July 14th, 1902, 13 days after the reported duel, Mary Wagoner was picking blackberries with her 12-year-old boy, George Wagoner.
The first thing we found was a black hat.
A foul odor led the boy to the man's body, decomposing in the July heat, with 3 bullets in it, 2 in the back, 1 in the head. Mary Wagoner instantly believed the body to be David Merrill, having read of Tracy's boasts of killing his partner in the papers, and reported the find to the sheriff.
Dead body of Outlaw Merrill is found, wedged between 2 logs. Discovery made by a woman and her son while out picking berries. Evidence that Tracy's story of assassination was true in details.
Did David Merrill make a deal with the law? If he did, apparently it was a poor one, as he was ultimately given 13 years in the Oregon State Prison. Did Harry Tracy kill David Merrill? Outlaw partners in violent crime, co-defendants at a public and prominent trial, 3 years confined together as convicts, as cellmates, co-workers at daily labor. And Harry Tracy killed David Merrill for something he read in the newspapers. That is the official story. It is not necessarily the truth. There was speculation and suspicion at the time. The Vanished Outlaw and 100 Years of Browns Park and Diamond Mountain both document strong evidence that David Land, after being Harry Tracy's first partner in crime, went on to live a long and quiet life under the name David Stillwell. These assertions, if true, set precedent for David Merrill to do likewise. David Merrill's brother Ben Merrill publicly proclaimed at an inquest held on July 16th,
I met with David and Harry while they were on the run.
Later it was Ben who officially identified the body of his brother, declaring the corpse was wearing the same clothes as last time he'd seen David.
Brother of Outlaw identifies the remains.
Ben swore vengeance.
I'll hunt down Tracy myself.
Ben Merrill never made any such attempt, as there is no record of him taking any part in the hunt for Harry Tracy. Ben Merrill did later marry Mary Wagoner, just over 3 years later, on August 31st, 1905, in Wenlock. Mary Wagner became Mary Merrill, the same woman who had found Ben's brother, David Merrill's body in the woods with her son George while picking blackberries. The prison doctor declared the corpse delivered to the Oregon State Penitentiary to be David Merrill, based on Merrill's medical file. However, Joseph Bunko Kelly, in 13 years in the Oregon State Penitentiary, declared that he and other inmates, on viewing the body, did not believe that it was David Merrill. I do not believe it was Merrill's body that was brought back to the penitentiary. Bunko wrote that time in the Oregon boot had visibly scarred David Merrill's ankle. A big scar on his ankle from the burn, and the band of the boot wore a dent into the skin. There was a hole in the ankle half an inch deep. The body they brought back had gray hair, and Merrill had none. Merrill is alive today.
Merrill is dead. Tracy killed his pal, just as he said. Body found at Napavine. Discovery made by a woman and her son while out picking blackberries.
Well, the engines broke down twice, but Tracy helped us fix them with a gun in one hand.
Harry declared he would not disembark the boat before dark. Dropping anchor at Meadow Point, Puget Sound, slightly north of Ballard.
He entertained us with dime novel stories of his deeds and by Josh and my son about his red hair.
Could you guide me inland on a trail that would take me to Lake Washington?
Frank Scott did guide Tracy into Seattle.
I have to get a 6-shooter. I need one badly. I must have it. I'll hold up a policeman and get his gun.
Not before having Scott bind the captain and the crewmen.
My son had a sore wrist, and Tracy noticed it. The boy, on account of the sore wrist, was bound at the elbow.
I'll send you a lot of money to make up for kidnapping you in the launch, for I'll have plenty of dough pretty soon. You acted pretty decent by me. Well, so long.
Harry Tracy, the Oregon convict who has successfully eluded numerous posses since his escape from prison, is either in Seattle or the immediate vicinity. Not satisfied with outwitting or scaring half to death a half-dozen sheriff's posses and nearly a regiment of state soldiery, Harry Tracy, the Oregon desperado, has turned his attention to Seattle. Tracy is looking for big game. He thirsts for a policeman, and a little gun party with a half-dozen deputy sheriffs would be sport much to his liking. And this is no joke either.
Seattle's founders, the Denny Party, did not arrive until 1851 and were the first pioneers to settle on the shores of Puget Sound. Then, on June 6, 1889, Seattle burnt to the ground.
A sea of fire! 32 blocks of smoking debris. The loss will exceed 10 millions.
Rebuilding Seattle utilized structures of brick and stone, modernizing the city. On July 17, 1897, the steamship Portland arrived in Seattle from Dawson, Alaska.
Latest news from the Klondike. Gold! 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 Gold!
The Klondike Gold Rush transformed Seattle, selling supplies to prospectors heading north to Alaska. In 1896, Seattle merchants sold $325,000 in goods. Between 1897 and March 1898, during the gold rush, the same sold $25 million. The 1900 U.S. Census set Seattle's population at 80,671. Seattle had 311 practicing lawyers, 178 physicians, 126 nurses, 55 dentists, and 11 veterinarians, 232 neighborhood groceries, 217 saloons, 74 meat markets, 43 bakeries, and 64 dairies. In July of 1902, the battleship Nebraska keel-laying ceremony at the Moran Brothers shipyard was an event that brought together the governors of 3 states and all the newspapers. The event marked an entrance into military production and nationally raised Seattle's profile as a major American city. The significant and ceremonial events of that weekend were converse to the major news stories of the day that Harry Tracy, escaped convict and desperate relic of the Wild West, was holding hostages and killing officers all across the city.
Tracy's trail of blood. Oregon convict kills 2 officers near Seattle. Desperado engages in 2 hot battles and continues his wild flight.
This reflected poorly on Seattle's current sheriff, Edward Cudahy.
They can't catch me in Seattle. I'm among friends.
Last seen, Harry Tracy had declared he was going to amble into Seattle, hold up a policeman, and maybe rob Clancy's saloon. This as he released his hostage, Frank Scott.
He walked into Seattle with his rifle in one hand and his pack over his shoulder.
But in actuality, Tracy had done the opposite. Doubling back and heading north towards Bothell, Louis Seffrit, a newspaper reporter, armed and embedded with the posse looking for Tracy in the Bothell area, noticed fresh tracks on a path that led down to a cabin. I pointed to a stump that stood about 25 feet in direct line in front of me. Instantly, Tracy arose from behind the stump I had pointed to, and as quick as lightning, his rifle was thrown to his shoulder. With Louis Seffrit was Deputy Sheriffs Jack Williams and L.J. Nelson, Snohomish County Deputy Sheriff Charles Raymond, and a fellow newspaperman, Carl Anderson.
The fight occurred at 3:15 in the afternoon and was over in an incredibly short time.
Carl Anderson was the first Seattleite to receive a bullet from Tracy's Winchester, grazing the cheek of the newsman.
The rain was falling so heavily that we were somewhat hampered in keeping a lookout.
Tracy fired 2 more shots, taking the life of Deputy Raymond.
When I saw Raymond fall, I fired 1 shot at Tracy from a Colt revolver. I was standing in the open directly in front of the convict. Tracy immediately shifted position of his rifle and let a bullet fly towards me. I heard it whizzing over my head.
With 1 bullet whizzing over his head, Louis Seffrit was the target of a second shot.
Tracy fired at me a second time, the bullet striking the ground at my left side.
Seffrit decided to play dead, rolling in proximity to the now deceased Detective Raymond.
His eyes were open and the stare on his face was frightful. Blood was rushing from his nose and his mouth. Death was so quick that he had not suffered.
Officer Charles Raymond left behind a widow and 5 children. Harry Tracy fired 3 more times, hitting Detective Williams, who thought he'd found cover.
Williams crawled out of the bush. He was shot 3 times under the heart, and even as he appeared in view, lurched to one side and stretched out, unconscious.
A separate account of the action says that one of Harry Tracy's bullets had shattered the barrel of Williams' gun, sending shrapnel deep into his chest and left wrist, accounting for the multiple wounds.
As Williams collapsed, Tracy disappeared.
No sign of Tracy. Outlaw eludes Seattle officers.
The whole adventure had hardly taken more than 2 or 3 minutes.
Williams never fully recovered and died a few years later as a result of complications from the wounds.
Tracy's trail of blood.
Directly after the gun battle, Harry Tracy was busy.
Drives away with stolen horse and buggy.
Kidnapping a farmer named Lewis Johnson and his buggy.
I'm a deputy sheriff and one of the men on Tracy's tail. I must get to Seattle at once and I need your wagon. There is no time for delay.
Part 8.
Blood in Ballard. Yesterday was a red-letter day in the erratic career of Harry Tracy.
The city of Seattle was astir on July 4th, 1902.
Tracy's trail of blood. Oregon convict kills 2 officers near Seattle.
The day before, escaped convict Harry Tracy killed Neil Raleigh, policeman E.E. Breeze, Deputy Sheriff Charles Raymond, and Sheriff John Williams, in 2 separate gun battles.
Desperado engages in 2 hot battles and continues his wild flight.
Harry Tracy instantly disappeared after the first bloody shootout in Ballard. He acted like a real gentleman. Harry Tracy hijacked Lewis Johnson in his buggy near Green Lake.
Give me your name and address.
Why?
Because I have troubled you a lot, and if I ever do get a big wad again, I'm gonna make things square with you. See?
Lewis Johnson became convivial with Harry Tracy and later declared that they talked easily. Why are you going back to Seattle? Don't you know that Sheriff Cudahy is close on your track?
Sheriff Cudahy is crowding me too closely. I want to get back to Seattle. This isn't a bluff. I want to get into the city before daylight.
Have you any hope of escaping?
I have had success so far.
Mrs. Van Horn was home and entertaining an elderly neighbor named Mr. Butterfield when Tracy knocked on the door. As Tracy entered, his buggy driver Lewis Johnson in tow, Mrs. Van Horn asked why her house.
It looked cozy.
Soaking wet, Tracy took Butterfield's clothes. Mrs. Van Horn furnished the elder Butterfield with a shawl. Removing the wet garments to be dried, she took the occasion to inventory Harry Tracy's pockets.
A razor, a broken piece of looking glass, a pocket knife, a small bottle of oil, and some letters. One of the letters in the upper right-hand corner was printed, Davis and Gilmore, Attorneys, Seattle. Tracy did some snooping himself and found a wounded young man in bed, upstairs, who had been thrown from a horse.
You're all right. You can't move.
After proclaiming the boy harmless, Tracy found a gun. The revolver was not the .45 he wanted, but a .38, not ideal, but far better suited for close quarters than his Winchester. There was a knock at the door, the grocery boy. Tracy warned her as he had her open the door, his Winchester ready. Mrs. Van Horn was able to silently mouth,
Tracy!
The grocery boy understood the alert, rushing directly back to Fremont, where word was sent. Sheriff Edward Cudahy, alerted that the escaped convict, now murdering men with seeming impunity across his city, was presently holding hostage the Van Horn home near Woodland Park.
It is my opinion that Tracy is crazy and that he will shoot any man on sight.
Sheriff Cudahy gave citywide orders directing all police and all posse members not to proceed to the Van Horn residence.
It is dangerous to have so many men after him.
Policeman Frank Breeze, Neil Raleigh, a game warden from Fremont, and a local insurance man named J.I. Knight raced to the Van Horn residence.
A lot of young fellows beating up the timber up there by Woodland Park that know nothing.
Breeze, Raleigh, and Knight. The three men arrived armed and ready to confront Harry Tracy, but were oblivious of Sheriff Cudahy and two of his men who had already taken position around the home. Breeze, Raleigh, and Knight making no effort to disclose themselves. Harry Tracy immediately emerged from the house into the darkening night. He flanked himself with Farmer Lewis Johnson on one side and neighbor Butterfield still in his shawl on the other. Tracy moved from the porch into the front yard. Breeze and Raleigh began to rush in on Tracy, with the obvious danger of Harry Tracy holding Johnson and Butterfield as human shields and his fugitive target further obfuscated by the rush of Breeze and Raleigh. There was no clear shot. Sheriff Cudahy and his men maintained their position and held their fire.
Maintain your position.
But Harry Tracy did not. Neil Raleigh screamed,
Tracy, you get him up and you be quick about it!
As the warning left Neil Raleigh's mouth, bullets left Harry Tracy's gun. There is a discrepancy as to whether Harry fired the .38 revolver, newly acquired from the Van Horn home, or his Winchester, or both. But by both accounts, Tracy fired immediately, killing without hesitation. Policeman Frank Breeze died instantly. Game warden and coal miner Neil Raleigh was mortally wounded and passed by morning. There was some speculation that the bullet that killed Raleigh had come from the gun of the local insurance man with him, J.I. Knight. Sheriff Cudahy claimed he got off 2 shots at Harry Tracy, 2 misses. The dark and the rain, the confusion and the gunshots, and the fact that the Van Horn home sat at the southwest corner of Woodland Park all became allies in Tracy's escape. Miss Van Horn refused to sit for a picture, saying she had enough notoriety. The sale of extra newspaper editions surged, one publication producing 8 different publications the next day.
Tracy's Trail of Blood. Oregon convict kills 2 officers near Seattle. Governor McBride calls out the state militia.
Sheriff Cudahy, who had been grazed in the neck, arresting Seattle's last deadly and infamous outlaw, Thomas Blank, had ridden the notoriety to success and was now expected to produce similar results in regard to Harry Tracy.
Sheriff Cudahy has called in all his posses. His plans to be changed. The cunning outlaw again eluded his pursuers.
Mayor Thomas J. Humes, who history now remembers most as a man resembling Mark Twain, was let down, as was Governor Henry McBride and the moneyed interest of Seattle. The 1902 4th of July weekend was planned to be noted for the ceremonial events around the battleship Nebraska keel-laying ceremony, the patriotic and prosperous opportunities that came with this major milestone in military production and shipbuilding in Seattle. But there was only one dominating topic of discussion: Harry Tracy. As newspapermen swarmed around the Van Horn house, collecting the story for the ever-increasing appetite for more Tracy, Harry doubled back again to Fremont and slept in a cemetery. The next morning, Harry Tracy appeared at the home of August Fisher, a recent immigrant from Germany, living 6 or so miles northwest of Fremont.
I am Tracy, and I want you to get me something to eat and do it quick. I am hungry as a bear. Both of you must come inside the house with me, and if you make any movement that looks like you mean me injury, I will kill you.
Tracy took a worn set of clean clothes from the Fishers.
I would prefer the black hat you have there, but I guess it's your Sunday article. As you appear poor man, I will leave it.
Mrs. Fisher declared,
I would have poisoned Tracy, but he watched me too closely.
I will not tie you people up because someone will have to attend that baby. Give me your solemn promise that you will not tell anyone that I have been here for the next 48 hours.
The Fisher family did not report Harry for the next 24 hours. Leaving the Fisher home, Harry then made his way back to Meadow Point, the very same spot where he'd landed previously, and found a Japanese fisherman who spoke very sparse English and forced the man into service for a ride across the Puget Sound and out of Seattle. Bainbridge Island lies across the Puget Sound from Seattle by about 10 miles. The abducted Japanese fisherman landed Harry above Port Madison by several miles and was then warned not to tell anyone anything, even in broken English.
The Japanese is still keeping quiet.
Tracy soon appeared at the Bainbridge home of John Johnson.
I am Tracy, and you best let me in.
Tracy read the papers, learning how Miss Van Horn had betrayed him to the grocery boy.
My carelessness in this respect made it necessary to kill 2 officers.
The detailed accounts of his exploits included how he'd gunned down Sheriff Raymond and then killed Raleigh and Breeze outside the Van Horn house.
That was a useless wasted life, but Cudahy was pursuing me too close, and I had to do what I did.
When Tracy left Bainbridge Island, he left well-fed and had John Anderson, a large young man who worked for the Johnsons and spoke very little English, tie the family up with instructions to bind the child and Miss Johnson very loosely. Tracy then helped himself to the Johnsons' newer 14-foot boat, took their young hand John Anderson with him as labor, and had Anderson row them into the night. The U.S. Revenue cutter Grant left Port Townsend searching the Puget Sound for Harry Tracy. Literally, the Navy had been called out. Tracy and Anderson tried several attempts at finding the mouth of the Duwamish River, but did not succeed in doing so they abandoned the boat.
Has Tracy allies in Seattle?
You know these people are looking for me.
John Anderson also declared that he witnessed Harry Tracy meeting up with friends.
Captain Anderson rescued. He gives information which makes it certain that 4 men are aiding the fugitive. Anderson tells of his trip. Captive makes it plain that Tracy is being aided by friends.
Young Anderson declared just before they reached the railroad bridge over the Black River, tributary of the Duwamish, they met 4 men. Anderson could not identify any of the men, but did say Tracy referred to one of them as Fred. Blindfolded and bound, Anderson was left alone for hours. After meeting with at least 4 other men, and on his return to Anderson, Harry had found a new group of friends, picking blackberries. First meeting young Charles Gurrell, and then his mother, Mrs. Gurrell.
Well, I am Tracy.
Harry had them all return to the Gurrell home, a 2-story frame house located a mile east of what was Renton proper at the time, about 100 feet from the Cedar River, close to the railroad tracks where they'd been picking blackberries. Harry Tracy then gave Charles Gurrell, an 18-year-old, 2 watches, one of them being Anderson's. He instructed Charles to go to town and sell the watches and buy him 2 Colt 45s with 6-inch barrels, and not to alert the law. "I'll help you, Tracy. I'm kind of scared, but I will help you." Young Charles Gurrell went directly to the sheriff's office in Seattle and told them that Harry Tracy was holding his family captive. Harry was carrying water in from the spring and saw a special train with deputies on board. From cover, Tracy watched as they disembarked just a quarter-mile away. He then returned to the Gurrell household to have lunch. The women all reportedly chatted easily with Harry, Miss May Baker later declaring Harry to be
A gallant, tender-hearted man with a prodigious love for little children.
Young Charles' betrayal had brought a swarm of policemen, posse, and newsmen. Soon it was evident to all that there was a growing crowd of lawmen and reporters directly outside the home.
Look at them. They want the reward money.
Mrs. McKinney was not as impressed with or as nice to the dashing bandit Harry Tracy as young Miss Baker and the other women evidently were.
A Seattle banker just added $1,000 to the reward, I hear.
If I meet him face to face, I'll let him try and earn it.
A burly man wearing a deputy's badge approached the home alone and knocked on the front door.
Is Tracy in there?
What would Tracy be doing in my kitchen?
Mrs. Gurrell's answer was enough to repel the possemen, baffled, from the house, providing a crucial stay of the inevitable flood of law that was soon to arrive in the home. The home was surrounded, the area dense with law.
Looks like they're not covering the river very well.
Harry Tracy slipped outside into the darkening rain of the afternoon.
You have beastly weather here on the Puget Sound. Why, it has rained the whole time nearly since I landed here. I think this is an unhealthy country.
Tracy walked down to the riverbank with his rifle in his hand. Several posse members reportedly saw him from the railroad tracks, but they thought he was one of the deputies. Harry Tracy disappeared.
Tracy again escapes. Surrounded by deputy sheriffs, he gives them the slip.
On arrival, Sheriff Cudahy soon sorted out what had happened and directed Guard Carson and his bloodhounds to the river bank.
Halfway between the Cedar River and the Burroughs boathouse, both dogs ran into cayenne pepper sprinkled on the outlaw's retreating footsteps.
As a courtesy to his canine pursuers, Tracy had left a thick trail of cayenne pepper.
Cayenne pepper dropped in tracks. Put dogs off scent for a time.
July 9th. Harry Tracy appeared at the home of rancher E.M. Johnson and family near the Green River Valley area.
Tracy looked tired and worn out. He complained that his left leg hurt him.
Tracy tiring. Outlaw thought wounded.
Tracy directed Johnson to ride a horse to Auburn and then take the train to Tacoma.
Have you any money? You've got to get me 2 6-shooters. I must have them.
Tracy instructed Johnson to buy 2 .45 caliber revolvers, but not from the same store. He knew the time the train departed from Auburn and how long the excursion would take, declaring Johnson should return by 6 p.m.
If you don't get the guns and come back alone, I'll kill your wife and children.
It was 8:30 a.m. when Johnson made for Auburn. Along with her teenage son and daughter, Mrs. Johnson was left to wait with Harry Tracy.
Have you ever heard me doing something bad to women or children?
Mrs. Johnson declared Harry bragged of robbing banks with the Wild Bunch.
robbed 5 banks in quick succession with 2 other men.
Mrs. Johnson said it made Harry mad to see stories about him in the papers.
Anderson told a lot of lies about how I treated him. I did tie him up. It was necessary.
E.M. Johnson was able to acquire a single .45 and 2 boxes of ammunition and return home by 4 p.m. E.M. arrived early, but was profusely apologetic that there was only 1 gun, not 2, and that it had a 7-inch barrel, not 6, as instructed. Harry disappeared for 3 days, and on Saturday, July 12th, limped up a country road to a small and secluded house near the Green River, south of Black Diamond. The home was owned by the Portreaus, an older French couple.
I guess you know who I am.
He did not look like a criminal. He treated us very nicely. It was hard to believe that he had such a black record.
The elder couple proclaimed that they felt no fear in the outlaw's presence and thought that he was on the edge of physical collapse.
I got wounded in the back just above the left hip. I was hit with buckshot.
Guard Carson and his bloodhounds and a posse showed up the next day and could find no trail. Harry Tracy had disappeared again. Part 9. Infamy. Summer of 1902. President Theodore Roosevelt's cabinet secretary George Cortelyou publicly denied stories claiming that the president had closely followed the progress of the manhunt for the Oregon escapee Harry Tracy in Washington state. Cortelyou denied the president was intrigued by Harry Tracy's constant ability to elude pursuers, and further stated that such a trivial story was beneath the interest of the office of the President of the United States. Harry Tracy was in the Eastern and even European press. Sensationalistic versions of Tracy and stories about and sightings of Harry Tracy became ubiquitous and imaginary. Around the country, Harry Tracy was on stage.
New York City. Outlaw Tracy on Bowery's stage. It required the efforts of the house policeman to save the sheriff and his posse in Tracy the Outlaw from assault by a hostile audience at the 3rd Avenue Theater, says the New York World.
In Boston,
Yesterday afternoon and evening at the Bowdoin Square Theater, Tracy the Bandit was presented to crowded houses. The generous applause which it received showed the large audience found it sufficient to interest them from beginning to end.
in the Northwest. Manhunt for Harry Tracy, a staged play where past victims told their encounters with the bandit Harry Tracy, included Frank Scott from the NNS, the gasoline launch that Harry had abducted out of Olympia and rode into Seattle, and John Anderson, Harry's indentured servant, cashed in on his celebrity, appearing in several stage plays.
Anderson was on exhibition in Seattle at several different places and netted over $200 in a few days. Anderson, Tracy's hired man at the Bon Marché today. Children should come with their parents as the crowds will be dense. At the 3rd Avenue Theater, Tracy is more of a hero on stage. He is a gentleman, a scholar, a tragedian, a flower of chivalry, a humorist, and a philosopher.
Let the average Seattle small boy witness the play, and he'll exchange his birthright for 30-30, kill his father and mother to effect his escape, and journey forth on the road, shooting down officers like chipmunks, asking fair maidens to dance, and capturing whole regiments of Swedes for body servants. Not since the gold rush had the Northwest gripped the public imagination or garnered this much attention. Many came to view Harry Tracy as a victim of the system, a downtrodden working-class Robin Hood. He's a brick, a jewel, a persecuted man. This mainly due to his captives' reports of his mannerly nature, consistent apologies, and promises of big wads of cash to make things right.
When I get to Seattle, I got friends there.
Question: where is Harry Tracy? Answer: he's everywhere. Harry appeared to be everywhere, certainly in the press, and abundant anecdotal stories. But in the summer of 1902, from July 15th to July 30th, Harry Tracy was considered officially missing.
No sign of Tracy. Lost all trace of the convict. Tracy is still out of sight.
Wednesday, July 30th, at the home of Sam McAdowney's, 6 miles out of Wenatchee, Tracy's first well-documented appearance east of the Cascades.
Sam, I see you don't remember me.
My God, it's Harry Tracy.
Sam had known Tracy in Portland before Harry's convictions. Harry found Sam's horses unsatisfactory and required Sam to steal some horses from his nearest neighbor.
Don't leave the premises for 24 hours or tell anyone I was here.
Tracy declared he planned to ride east across Washington, Idaho, Montana, and into Wyoming, back to join friends at Hole in the Wall. The west side of Washington state is far more populated than eastern Washington, and the political power is centered there now as it was then, Olympia being the capital. The Puget Sound region is hemmed in by mountains, the Olympic Mountain Range to the west, Mount Baker to the north, and the Cascades to the east, including Mount Rainier. The ocean and the mountains promote a coastal marine layer where rain and clouds and drizzle can be continual. So wet and forested is the west side of Washington state that it has established the national reputation for the entire state.
The Evergreen State.
Washington's nickname was first proposed in 1890 by Charles T. Conover of Seattle. The Cascade Mountains separate the state, and the western area captures most of the rain. The rain shadow of the Cascades create diverse and even desert-like terrains in eastern Washington, partially decorating it with volcanic rock, scablands, and cliffs. Central Washington is plains-like, grass fields and land ripe for agriculture, wide open country. Sheriff Brown of Kickatas County, the summer of 1902, understood the difference between the western and the eastern sides of the Cascade Mountains and what it meant for Harry Tracy.
Should Harry Tracy emerge from the cover of the Puget Sound forest and head down the eastern slope, it will be a question of speed, not strategy. Nature will not aid him in providing a safe retreat at every turn, and field glasses rather than bloodhounds will come into question.
Sheriff Cudahy was not stopping at the border of the Cascades and declared he would pursue Harry Tracy.
Tracy can only pass over the mountain range at 2 points. One is to follow up the Green River Valley across the Stampede Pass where the Northern Pacific goes through. The other is to take the partly completed state road built in 1896 that leads from the White River Pass to the headwaters of the Yakima. The latter is a difficult route and uninhabited the entire distance.
A warning to Cudahy.
The August 5th Spokesman Review ran the following salutation from a note found pinned to the well of farmer C.V. Drazon.
To whom it may concern, tell Cudahy to take a tumble and let me alone, or I will fix him plenty. I'll be on my way to Wyoming. If your horses was any good, I would swap with you. Thanks for the cool drink. Harry Tracy.
In 1902, Coulee City had 7 gambling halls in town and a population of just over 100. Sheriff Cudahy arrived in Coulee City shortly after noon on August 2nd. The next day, after 2 in the afternoon, Cudahy headed for Edwall, seeking to block Harry Tracy's path. But Harry had gone along Wilson Creek, just south of the town of Almira. Local lore says that Harry stayed in some caves there that to this day are called Tracy's Caves. In the open prairie, about 10 miles south of Creston, Washington, Harry surprised a young lad named George Goldfinch.
Why, that'd be the Eddy place, sir, run by Lou and Jean Eddy, who are brothers.
When Tracy came to the ranch Sunday morning, accompanied by young Goldfinch, he subjugated and enslaved us in his own inimitable style. First, I had to unsaddle and feed his horses. Tracy worked all of Monday, August 4th, and much of the next day helping build a barn with the Eddies.
Well, he made himself useful around the place. We were putting up a barn, and Tracy spent much of his time carrying boards and nailing on the roof. He was a first-class worker.
Tuesday morning, August 5th, young George Goldfinch decided to inform the law that Harry Tracy was holed up at the Eddy Brothers Ranch. Goldfinch rode into Creston and telegraphed Sheriff Jerry H. Gardner in Davenport, 15 miles to the east. The telegraph made plans to meet with the sheriff and his men and lead them to the Eddy place. Joe Morrison was in the telegraph office at the time, as well as Maurice Smith, who contacted 3 other Creston citizens, Constable C.A. Staub, Dr. C.E. Lanter, and Oscar Lillengreen. These men became known as the Creston Posse. The Creston Posse hired a buggy and team and took off to the Eddy place, arriving in time to have a gun battle.
Who are those men with guns?
Tracy bolted from where he was working on the barn, and the Creston Posse opened fire. Returning fire, Harry Tracy had just reached a large rock in the middle of the field, some 200 yards from the posse, when he violently lunged forward, grabbing his right leg. Harry Tracy had been hit. 3 different posse members later declared credit for the shot. The initial exchange took only moments, but a long standoff soon ensued, Tracy at the foot of a large rock holding them off with an occasional shot. With the dangerous fugitive Tracy wounded but living, the Creston Posse decided it was the best move to wait him out. The sun slowly waned, finally setting well after 9. Sheriff Gardner and his men from Davenport arrived, surrounding the field. The night took hold, and Harry made a move into the wheat field. The posse saw the stalks moving and opened up with a barrage of bullets. About 10:30 p.m., a single shot cracked the silence of the night. There was suspicion and speculation as to what just happened, but it was too dark for anyone to see anything clearly, and none of the posse members volunteered to brave the dark. In the morning light, they found Harry Tracy, 2 bullet holes in his leg, a tourniquet tied atop in an attempt to stop the bleeding. There was a revolver in his right hand. As a result of a self-inflicted gunshot wound above his right eye, there was a gaping hole in Harry's forehead. That was Harry Tracy's final escape.
Murderer Tracy sends a bullet into his brain. Tracy is dead. Wounded by a posse, he ends his troubles and shoots himself rather than be captured alive. Tragic fate befalls noted Oregon outlaw. Tracy's last fight, Desperado died by his own hand. Tracy killed himself when at last cornered. Shots fired by pursuing posse had broken the leg and severed an artery, and death was inevitable. Crowd of relic seekers strips the body of gory souvenirs.
Harry Tracy's corpse was wrapped in a tarp and taken to Davenport.
Seek Tracy relics. Dead bandits' goods are badly scattered.
In Davenport, a growing and aggressive crowd.
There was a large wound in the right forehead, and the left leg below the knee was shattered. With the tourniquet, his leather belt still in place.
I Touched Harry Tracy's Corpse by Charles May Anderson, M.D., was published in the Pacific Northwesterner in the fall of 1973.
Some of the crowd broke in and started cutting Tracy's clothes, shoestrings, hair, and even his gun belt for souvenirs, but they were quickly pushed out.
Dr. Anderson, a childhood resident of Davenport, was 11 years old in August of 1902. When Tracy's remains were secured in the back room of his older brother's store.
This was my first introduction to the macabre nature of men, but was macabre enough myself to squeeze his shattered leg. It was mushy, as if there were sand in it.
Tracy's exit. The bold outlaw, surprised and mortally injured, commits suicide. The glory is due to the Creston men alone.
The Davenport mortician who prepared Harry Tracy's body. The posse got off more than 30 shots to no more than 4 or 5 from Tracy. Too much like shooting fish in a barrel. Maurice Smith, a local attorney and member of the Creston Posse, examined Tracy's rifle and found the front sight bent out of position. I believed it had struck the house-sized rock when Tracy dived into the green at its base. Harry Tracy was placed in a plain zinc-lined box and put aboard a train to Portland. Constable Staub of the Creston Posse sat on the box the entire trip.
Souvenir hunters would have cut so many hunks off that there wouldn't have been much left.
Career of Tracy ends. Harry Tracy's body on the way to Salem.
Acid had been poured on the face to discourage body snatchers from attempting to steal Tracy's remains to sell.
Convict's dead face burned by vitriol before burial. Tracy's body buried.
Some accounts have Harry Tracy buried next to David Merrill, but all the graves were unmarked and later covered over with fill and then concrete as part of prison expansion.
Remains were covered in quicklime and buried. Tracy's finish, cold in death from a self-inflicted wound.
There was no burial ceremony for Harry Tracy, and he was best eulogized by Joseph D. Lee, superintendent of the Oregon State Penitentiary, in his biennial report, 1902.
Without a dollar of estate, with a reputation for crime only, while yet a young man, his sun set in darkness, and his remains lie unhonored in a prison cemetery.
Harry lived on in legend, in stage plays and popular dime novels, silent films, comic books, television, and movies. And as the infamy of Tracy slowly faded into a shadowy remembrance, Harry Tracy, the cold-blooded killing convict and last of the wild bunch, quickly became a relic of the previous century. And in the end, it was not the guards at the Oregon State Penitentiary nor the hundreds of armed sheriff's posse members, military and newspaper men in hot pursuit that proved able to corner and kill Harry. It took young George Goldfinch, in his own act of courage, to defy the direct threats of a confirmed killer, to contact and coordinate the authorities to corner Tracy. It took Harry Tracy himself to kill Harry Tracy. So if you watch that whole video, you're pretty cool.